Hello and welcome to the Wee Geeks Guide to RPA. This particular video forms part of a Skills Lab series which focuses on small automated projects in UiPath. So today's challenge is based on a common use case: check and send a file onwards if it has content. Now this in itself could form part of a larger automation, but for today's use case let's just assume that the robot is checking a location for a file. If it exists, check the file size, and if it is larger than say 100 kilobytes, compress and email the file. Okay, so let's just delve right in. What I would like the robot to do in this particular automation is to iterate through a parent folder to see if any files that reside in there are over 100 kilobytes or more. Now the robot needs to iterate through each of these subfolders, and where it finds a particular file with that file size of over 100 kilobytes, then retrieve the information around it and put it into a zip folder by means of compressing it and emailing it via Outlook. Now in order to do that, I've split the robot into three main sequences. The first, as you can see here, is called check files. Check files initially starts with a build data table activity, which consists of two columns. Now the columns themselves, as you can see, are blank at the moment, but the robot will populate them within this main sequence. The two columns are of type string, and the robot outputs this particular variable to a DT file details. Now that particular variable, as you can see here within the variable pane, has a full scope of the flowchart itself, so meaning that the robot can retrieve all the information from this sequence elsewhere. The next activity that it's going to do is actually retrieve the files. Now I've done this in one particular assign activity, whereas you may often see, and I really dislike this approach, but you can see it as a nested loop where it will initially go through a parent folder, then go into a nested loop for any subfolders, and continue in traversing the directories themselves, and it will just take forever. This particular variable uses a kind of value whereby we're going to go in, we're using the directory.getFiles. Within the parentheses, I've passed in the source directory where I want to receive all the files. That I've stipulated down here within the actual variable pane itself, as you can see, is the input folder itself. In terms of options, what I've used here is to basically collect any file name with any extension. Now if you wanted to, within this first portion before the actual dot, is you could put in here, like say a date, or you could put in a static name, something that you want the robot to only focus on. Similarly with regards to the extension, I've done any extension here. You could do .xlsx, .doc, .text, whatever you need to focus on, you can stipulate in this particular portion. Otherwise, if you literally want to pick up everything that's in there, then you can leave it as asterisk, and that basically said two wildcards on either side. The search option that I've stipulated here is all directories, meaning that the robot will iterate through all of the subfolders here rather than just remain on this top level. The next action that the robot completes is a for each loop, and what we're doing in here is basically iterating through everything that we have in that array files variable. And again, the array files variable is set to array of type strings, and the scope for that is check files. Now for each item, I'm going to output the index of int index to a variable, and the robot is literally going to do a couple of activities in here. The first activity is an assign, where I'm passing the information to a variable called str file path. That particular variable is of type file info, which you can modify in here if you don't see it. All you would need to do is type system.fileinfo into this browse for types, and it will populate for you. I've limited the scope for this to the actual body itself, and the actual value that I've set it to look at is as follows. So it's new file info, and then within the actual parentheses itself, I'm passing in array files, and within further parentheses it's int index.string. The reason that I'm doing that is that for each iteration, this particular int index is incrementing, therefore it will pick up the next file in that particular array. The next action that I'm going to complete is to retrieve the actual file name itself, meaning that I would like the robot to ascertain the actual file name and the extension, meaning that rather than this full path here that I'm retrieving in this first activity, this second activity here is just going to get the file name and the extension. So once it's received that information, the next and last assign activity in here is the actual file size itself, which is a double. And you can see here double.file size, the double type itself is scope of body. The actual value I've set within parentheses, and it's converting to double, and it's new file info. The file path variable is the one we've initially set here. We're putting that to string, and we're getting the length of that, and we're dividing that by 1024, meaning that we'll get the full kilobytes size rather than an arbitrary number. The last activity that we're completing in here is an if clause. So if the actual size of the file that we've retrieved is greater than the threshold, and the threshold is set again down in our variables panel, so I've typed double, and I've set the default to 100. So if the file size is greater than 100, pass out some debugging messages here so I can see the size, the file path and the file name. And I'm adding that information to the data table. So again, it's just the two columns that we are choosing to populate here, and that's the file name and the full file path. That is gone to DT file details, and the only other activity that I'm doing in here is out with the actual loop itself, and that's basically just debugging to see what's the contents of the data table currently is. So get the data table, pass that output to a test string, and then write the test string in the output itself. Now the robot then follows a condition, so DT file details. So if the data table rows.count is greater than 0, meaning that we've found some files to actually pass on, we're going to move those files. That is done by means of using a for each data table activity. Now what I've done here is basically to stipulate for each file within the data table file details, just do an arbitrary right line in here so I can see where it's moving from and where it's going to, then physically move the file from file1.toString, which is effectively the second column in that data table, which we know is the full file path, and we're going to move that to a temporary directory, which I've stipulated down here in the variables panel, and with that I'm stipulating the actual file name itself. So in effect, pass the information to this temporary directory and include the file name at the end of it, so it knows exactly what it should be called when it reaches that. You can select to overwrite the actual move, otherwise you can just leave this blank. For me, I didn't see any value in overwriting the files for this particular demonstration, though it's very much up to yourselves if you choose to do so. The last actions that the robot completes is effectively compress the files that it's found into a folder. The way that it does that is an invoke method activity, which you can search here in your activities panel. You would simply drag this over and you would populate the target type and the method name itself. Now, as you can see with this particular demo, I already have this populated. Now, the target type itself is system.io.compression.zip file. Again, if you don't see this automatically populated, you can browse for the file types and just pass that full name in, and you'll see this particular target type populated. Target object is left blank, and the method name that we're using for this is create from directory. Now, once you have that populated, the only other thing that you need to do is pass in the parameters, and that's found over in your properties menu here on the right. So the actual parameters I'm passing in is the temporary directory, which again is stipulated down here in your variables panel, and the actual output zip path you want to send it to. Now, as you can see here within the variables panel, I've stipulated the output path, but it's important to remember the extension, so .zip to whatever your output is that you've selected. The last action that I'm completing in here is to send an Outlook message. The recipient I've stipulated again down as my default value. The body can be literally anything you need, and you simply select attach files and pass in that parameter of your output zip path, whatever that may be in here. So without further ado, run through the actual file itself and you can see the robot in action. So if I hit file and run, and as you can see here, it's running the actual job, it's opening up Outlook itself, it's sending the actual file in the background, and that's it complete. So in our output pane, we can see that it found two files, both of the same size, which is just under 500 kilobytes. The file path that it indicated for the file that it found is as shown. The file name is just standalone with the extension. Second file is test4. and it's output the actual contents of the data table just for debugging purposes, stipulated where it's moving from and where it's going to, and it's concluded with the number of files to send. Now what I would encourage you to do is try and follow the steps in this video. Try and really understand how to make use of the file info variables. This is really just the bare bones, but it's up to yourself to try and take these trainings and build upon the learnings to make yourself a better RPA developer. I'd encourage you to like and subscribe to this particular channel just so you can keep up to date with any new automations that might give you some more ideas or perhaps improve your learning. And as always, please feel free to comment. It's always nice to hear from you guys, wherever you're at, and see you soon. Take care.